The blood-red sunset painted the horizon as Thomas Fletcher stared down the barrel of his own Colt revolver, the cold metal trembling in his grasp. 5 years since Antietam, and still the nightmares wouldn't leave him be. A vulture circled overhead, patient in its vigil, as if sensing the decision weighing on the weathered cowboy's soul. With a curse that scattered nearby jackrabbits, Thomas lowered the gun and tucked it back into his holster. Not today. Maybe tomorrow. Wyoming Territory, 1867. The untamed frontier had become Thomas's refuge after the war that had taken everything: his family, his faith, his will to connect with another living soul. Mojave wasn't a town that existed in these parts, but Laramie had become his reluctant home, a place where a man could disappear into work and whiskey without too many questions about the shadows behind his eyes. The Triple Creek Ranch sprawled across the eastern Wyoming prairie, backed by the imposing silhouette of the Laramie Range. Thomas had purchased it 3 years ago with money saved from bounty hunting, a trade that suited a man with his marksmanship and detachment from human life. The ranch was remote enough that he could go weeks without speaking more than a handful of words to another person, just how he preferred it. "Fletcher, you hearing me?" Thomas blinked, the voice of Silas Dawson, his ranch foreman, pulling him back to the present. The older man stood at the corral fence, his white beard catching the last rays of sunlight. "Said there's a stagecoach coming up the road. Unusual this time of evening." Thomas frowned. The ranch lay 5 miles off the main trail, and visitors were rare by design. "Probably lost," he muttered, swinging onto his chestnut stallion. "I'll head them off." The approaching stagecoach kicked up dust that glowed copper in the fading light. Thomas intercepted it a quarter mile from the main house, raising a hand to signal the driver. The coach slowed, and Thomas noted the lack of a shotgun messenger, not a mail or bank run then. "Private charter." "You're off course, mister," Thomas called up to the driver, a thin man with a perpetual squint. "Laramie's 15 miles northeast." The driver spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Got a passenger, says she's expected at Triple Creek. Name of Miss Abigail Morrison." Thomas stiffened in the saddle. "There's been a mistake. I'm not expecting anyone." Before the driver could respond, the coach door swung open, and a woman stepped out without waiting for assistance. The fading light illuminated a face framed by auburn hair, tucked partially beneath a modest traveling hat. She wore a practical traveling dress of navy blue, dusty from the journey but well made. Her posture spoke of determination rather than weariness, though she'd clearly been traveling for some time. "Mr. Fletcher." Her voice carried across the distance between them with surprising clarity. "I'm Abigail Morrison. My uncle Edward Morrison arranged for my stay." Thomas stared hard at the woman, his jaw tightening. Edward Morrison had been his commanding officer during the war, a good man who died at Cold Harbor, taking a bullet meant for Thomas. "Edward Morrison has been dead for 3 years, madam." The woman's composure faltered slightly. "Yes, I'm aware. Before his death, he wrote to me about you and this ranch. I've been in Boston until now, settling my parents' estate after they passed from influenza last winter." Thomas remained stone-faced, but his mind raced. Edward had indeed mentioned a niece once or twice during quiet moments around campfires, but he'd never suggested sending her west. "That doesn't explain your presence here, Miss Morrison." She lifted her chin slightly. "My uncle's final letter indicated that should I ever need sanctuary, I might find it with you. He seemed to believe you owed him a debt of honor." The words struck Thomas like a physical blow. Edward's dying words had been a request for Thomas to live truly live, not just survive. A request Thomas had failed miserably at honoring. "Your uncle saved my life," Thomas conceded, but I run a working cattle ranch, not a boarding house for Eastern ladies. I don't require charity, Mr. Fletcher." Her voice cooled. "I have sufficient funds to compensate you for lodging, and I'm not afraid of work. I simply require temporary accommodation while I determine my next steps. Uncle Edward spoke highly of your character, though I'm beginning to wonder if his assessment was mistaken." The challenge in her words wasn't lost on Thomas. He glanced at the darkening sky, then back at the woman. Whatever her true purpose, he couldn't send her back toward Laramie tonight. The road was dangerous after dark, especially for a lone woman. "One night," he finally said. "You can stay one night and we'll sort this out tomorrow." Relief briefly softened her features before determination returned. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher." Thomas nodded to the driver. "Follow me to the house." The main house of Triple Creek Ranch was modest compared to some spreads, but solidly built of local timber and stone. Thomas had added to the original structure, creating a 2-story dwelling with 4 bedrooms upstairs, though he only used one. The kitchen was large, as was the main living area with its stone fireplace. It was a house built for a family that would never exist. After showing Abigail to a sparsely furnished guest room, Thomas retreated to the porch with a bottle of whiskey. The night was clear, stars emerging like silver pinpricks in the navy blue canvas above. He took a long pull from the bottle, letting the familiar burn trace down his throat. "Mr. Fletcher." He turned to find Abigail standing in the doorway. She'd removed her hat, allowing her auburn hair to fall in waves past her shoulders. In the lamplight from the house, he noticed her eyes were a striking green. "The room is more than adequate, thank you," she hesitated. "I understand my arrival is unexpected. I should have written ahead, but circumstances in Boston became complicated rather suddenly." Thomas took another drink. What kind of complications drive a woman alone across the country to a stranger's doorstep? Something flickered in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or anger quickly suppressed. The kind that make one realize that not all dangers wear uniforms or carry rifles in battle. Before Thomas could respond, she continued, "My uncle wrote that you were a man of few words but solid principles. He said you fought with honor and carried burdens few could understand. He also mentioned you were stubborn as a mule." Despite himself, Thomas felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Edward had a way with words. "Yes," she agreed softly. "He did." After a pause, she added, "I won't impose on your hospitality longer than necessary, Mr. Fletcher. Good night." Long after she'd returned inside, Thomas remained on the porch, staring at the stars and wondering what Edward would think of the man he'd become. Not much, he suspected. The old Thomas Fletcher, the one before Antietam and Cold Harbor, might have welcomed Edward's niece with genuine hospitality. That Thomas had died on the battlefield alongside so many others. The next morning, Thomas rose before dawn as usual. He was surprised to find Abigail already in the kitchen, dressed in a simple skirt and blouse, her hair neatly braided. She'd started coffee and was examining the meager pantry contents. "You're up early," he observed, pouring himself coffee. "I've never been one to idle," she replied. "Your pantry is woefully understocked, Mr. Fletcher. Do you subsist primarily on coffee and salt pork?" "There's beans," he pointed out. She raised an eyebrow. "Indeed, the makings of a feast." Thomas found himself momentarily disarmed by her dry wit. "The ranch hands eat at the bunkhouse. Silas's wife, Martha, handles their meals, and you," he shrugged. "I manage, poorly from the evidence." She sipped her coffee. "Mr. Fletcher, I've been considering our situation. I propose a temporary arrangement. I need accommodation, and you appear to need someone to put your house in order. I'm an excellent cook and housekeeper." Thomas frowned. "I don't need a housekeeper." "With respect, sir, you absolutely do." She gestured around the kitchen, which he had to admit was hardly a model of cleanliness or organization. "I suggest a trial period. 1 month. I'll cook and keep house in exchange for room and board, plus a small wage if my work proves satisfactory. And after a month, if either of us finds the arrangement unsuitable, I'll depart with no hard feelings. By then, I should have correspondence from my attorney in Boston regarding my parents' estate and other matters." Thomas studied her face, searching for the real story behind her presence. There was something she wasn't saying, something that had driven her to seek out a tenuous connection in the wilderness of Wyoming. "These complications in Boston," he pressed. "They likely to follow you here?" A shadow crossed her face. "I don't believe so. But if they did, I wouldn't allow them to become your concern." Thomas drained his coffee. "I'll think on it. Need to check the north pasture today. We've had wolves coming down from the mountains. You can stay until I return." He spent the day in the saddle, riding fence lines and checking on cattle with his ranch hands. The physical work usually cleared his mind, but today his thoughts kept returning to the woman in his house. There was something about Abigail Morrison that unsettled him, not just her unexpected arrival or the mystery surrounding her journey west, but the way she looked at him, as if she could see past the hardened exterior to the broken man beneath. By the time Thomas returned to the ranch house that evening, the sun was setting. The first thing he noticed was the smell-rich, savory aromas drifting from the kitchen windows. The second was the transformation of the front porch. It had been swept clean, the chairs arranged properly, and someone had placed a small vase of prairie wildflowers on the small table. Inside, the change was even more dramatic. The main room had been thoroughly cleaned, floors swept, furniture dusted, and the accumulated debris of bachelor living removed. Through the doorway, he could see Abigail at the kitchen stove, her back to him as she stirred something in a large pot. "You've been busy," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. She turned, wiping her hands on a towel. "I hope you don't mind. I borrowed a wagon and had one of your hands, Billy, I believe, take me to town for supplies. I've recorded every expense." Thomas walked further into the room, noting the polished surface of the dining table, the arranged chairs, the absence of dust and disorder. "You did all this in one day. Hard work helps me think." She gestured toward the stove. "Supper will be ready shortly. There's water heated if you'd like to wash up." The meal was the best Thomas had eaten in years: venison stew with vegetables and fresh baked bread. He ate in silence while Abigail maintained a polite stream of conversation, commenting on the ranch, the countryside, the town of Laramie. "You went to considerable trouble," he finally said as she served apple pie for dessert, "especially for a one-night stay." Abigail met his gaze steadily. "Have you decided to extend my visit then?" Thomas studied her face, still searching for hidden motives. 1 month, he finally said. "Trial basis, as you suggested. Room and board plus $5 a week." Relief softened her features momentarily before she composed herself. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. You won't regret it." "Thomas," he said gruffly, "if you're staying, might as well use my name." "Thomas," she repeated with a small smile. "And I'm Abigail, though friends call me Abby. I'm not much for friendship, Miss Morrison." Her smile didn't falter. "We all need someone to count on, Mr. Fletcher, even lone wolves." Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas found his carefully constructed solitude systematically dismantled. Abigail transformed the ranch house from a sparse shelter into something approaching a home. Curtains appeared at windows, the pantry filled with preserved foods, and meals became events rather than necessities to endure. More disturbing to Thomas was how the ranch hands responded to her presence. They removed their hats when she approached, competed for her attention with small gestures, and generally behaved like schoolboys rather than hardened cowboys. Even old Silas seemed rejuvenated, bringing Abigail wildflowers and special cuts of meat from their hunts. Thomas maintained his distance, rising before dawn and returning after dark when possible. But even he couldn't deny that returning to a clean house with good food and fresh coffee was a welcome change. What troubled him was how quickly he was growing accustomed to Abigail's presence, the sound of her humming as she worked, the flash of auburn hair in sunlight, her quiet strength as she tackled tasks without complaint. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, Thomas returned earlier than usual due to a sudden thunderstorm. He found Abigail in the main room, seated in a chair by the fire, reading one of the few books from his meager collection. She looked up as he entered, water dripping from his slicker. "You're soaked," she observed, setting aside the book and rising. "Let me take that." Thomas removed his wet coat and handed it to her. "Storm came up sudden, had to bring the horses in early. There's coffee and stew keeping warm." She hung his coat by the fire. "And I managed to find flour for biscuits in town yesterday." Thomas nodded and moved toward the kitchen, but stopped when he noticed what she'd been reading, a collection of Whitman's poems he'd carried through the war. "You like poetry?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Abigail glanced at the book. "Yes, Whitman captures something essential about America, don't you think, both its darkness and its promise?" "Edward gave me that book," Thomas said quietly. "Said a man needed beauty in his life, even in war, especially in war. My uncle was a wise man." She hesitated. "I found a photograph tucked in the pages, you and Uncle Edward with other soldiers." Thomas tensed. "Wasn't mine to keep, should have been sent to his family. He would have wanted you to have it." Her voice was gentle. "You were like a son to him." Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the constriction that preceded the memories he fought daily to suppress. "Your uncle died because of me. Took a bullet meant for me at Cold Harbor. Don't talk about what he would have wanted." Abigail didn't flinch at his harsh tone. "He died protecting someone he valued. That was his choice." "A poor choice," Thomas muttered. "I disagree." Her gaze was steady. "My uncle was an excellent judge of character. If he believed you were worth saving, then you were. You still are." Thomas turned away, unwilling to continue the conversation. "I need to check on the horses." He spent an hour in the stable, the familiar smells and sounds of the animals soothing his troubled mind. By the time he returned to the house, Abigail had retired to her room, leaving his meal warming by the fire. As he ate alone, Thomas found himself staring at the Whitman book, remembering Edward's voice reading passages around campfires, bringing moments of humanity to inhuman circumstances. The following day brought clear skies and the arrival of the monthly mail delivery. Among the correspondence was a letter for Abigail, the envelope bearing a Boston postmark. Thomas handed it to her without comment as she prepared the midday meal, but noticed how her fingers trembled slightly as she took it. "News from home?" he asked casually. "My attorney," she confirmed, tucking the letter into her pocket. "I'll read it later." Thomas nodded and headed back outside, but curiosity gnawed at him throughout the day. When he returned that evening, Abigail seemed distracted during dinner, her usual easy conversation replaced by preoccupied silence. "Bad news?" he finally asked as she cleared the plates. Abigail hesitated. "Not unexpected news. My parents' estate is settled, but there were complications. The house had to be sold to settle debts I wasn't aware existed." "So you're without means?" "No," she quickly assured him. "I have sufficient funds from my mother's personal property." "But the situation in Boston remains difficult." Thomas studied her face, reading the worry in her eyes despite her composed expression. This difficulty have a name, her hand stilled on the dishes. Nathaniel Harrington. He was my father's business partner. After my parents died, he offered marriage as a way to protect me from financial hardship. Generous offer, Thomas remarked, noting the tension in her shoulders. It was a thinly veiled attempt to gain control of what remained of my father's business interests. Her voice hardened. When I declined, he became increasingly insistent. Eventually, his persistence turned threatening. Threatening how? He implied that a woman alone in Boston might face unfortunate accidents or find herself committed to an asylum if deemed emotionally unstable. Her eyes met Thomas's. Grief over losing one's parents can manifest in many concerning ways, according to some doctors on Mr. Harrington's payroll. Cold anger settled in Thomas's chest. And the law? The law, Abigail said bitterly, considers Mr. Harrington a respected businessman whose concern for his deceased partner's daughter is commendable. My attorney advises that Harrington has inquired about my whereabouts. He suggested I remain discreet about my location for the time being. Thomas leaned back in his chair. He won't find you here. I don't wish to bring trouble to your door, Thomas. My month is nearly up. Perhaps I should move on to California as I originally planned. You planning to run forever? Her chin lifted. I'm not running. I'm choosing my own path. Then choose to stay, Thomas said, the words surprising him as much as her. Until the situation resolves itself. Triple Creek is remote and my men are loyal. No one would find you here unless I allowed it. Gratitude flickered in her eyes. Why would you do that for me? Thomas considered the question. Edward would have wanted me to help, and you've improved things around here. The men would revolt if your cooking disappeared. It wasn't the whole truth. Something had shifted in Thomas over the past weeks, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself since the war. Abigail's presence had become, not unwelcome. The thought of her leaving created an uncomfortable hollow feeling he wasn't ready to examine. Thank you, she said softly. I accept your offer, at least until I receive further word from my attorney. Life at Triple Creek Ranch settled into a new rhythm over the following weeks. Spring advanced across the Wyoming prairie, bringing wildflowers and the busy season of calving. Abigail extended her role beyond the house, helping Martha with the vegetable garden and even assisting with gentling the new foals. Her confidence around the animals surprised Thomas until she mentioned growing up visiting her grandfather's farm in Vermont. One afternoon, Thomas found her in the corral with Lightning, a spirited 3-year-old mare no one had fully succeeded in taming. Abigail stood in the center of the enclosure, speaking softly as the horse circled her cautiously. You shouldn't be in there, Thomas called from the fence. That horse has thrown every hand who's tried to ride her. Abigail didn't look away from the mare. She's not mean-spirited, just afraid. Someone was rough with her before you got her. Thomas watched as Abigail slowly raised her hand, allowing the horse to catch her scent. To his amazement, Lightning stepped forward, nostrils flaring before gently nudging Abigail's palm. How did you do that? He asked when Abigail finally exited the corral. She smiled. Patience. Understanding. Recognizing that fear often masks itself as anger or defiance. Thomas had the uncomfortable feeling she wasn't just talking about the horse. You have a way with difficult creatures. All creatures respond to kindness eventually, she replied, her green eyes meeting his. Even the ones that believe they are beyond reaching. As May turned to June, Thomas found himself spending more time at the house, returning earlier from daily work, lingering over meals, even occasionally joining Abigail on the porch in the evenings. They rarely spoke of personal matters. Thomas still deflected questions about his past, and Abigail seemed content to respect his boundaries. Instead, they discussed books, the operations of the ranch, news from town, and the changing landscape around them. On a warm evening in late June, Thomas returned from Laramie with supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mail came," he said, placing the package on the table where Abigail was kneading bread dough. "For you." She wiped her hands on her apron and examined the package curiously. "I wasn't expecting anything. Shopkeeper's wife thought you might like it." Thomas turned away, suddenly uncomfortable. New book of poems or some such. Abigail unwrapped the package to reveal a leather-bound volume of Tennyson. Her fingers traced the embossed cover. "Thomas, this is lovely, but not from me," he quickly clarified. "Mrs. Barton at the general store said she appreciated the preserves you sent." A knowing smile curved Abigail's lips. "Of course. Please convey my thanks to Mrs. Barton when you next see her." Thomas nodded and escaped to the porch, aware that his deception was transparent. He had indeed purchased the book after noticing how she'd lingered over Whitman's poems. It was a small gesture, insignificant really, yet he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it directly. Later that night, after supper, Abigail joined him on the porch with the book in hand. Without comment, she seated herself in the chair beside his and began to read aloud, her voice carrying softly in the evening air as she shared Tennyson's words about courage and perseverance. Thomas closed his eyes, letting her voice wash over him. For the first time in years, the constant tension in his shoulders began to ease. The nightmares that had plagued him since the war had diminished in recent weeks. He slept better knowing Abigail was under the same roof, her steady presence a reassurance he hadn't realized he needed. The peaceful routine was shattered one July morning when a rider approached the ranch at full gallop. Thomas was checking fence lines with two of his hands when he saw the dust cloud in the distance. Something about the urgency of the approach set his instincts on alert. "Rider coming fast," he observed to Billy, the youngest of his ranch hands. "Head back to the house. Tell Silas to keep an eye out." As Billy rode toward the ranch buildings, Thomas continued watching the approaching rider. The man reined in his lathered horse when he spotted Thomas Fletcher. The rider was young, barely 20, with the look of a town clerk rather than a cowhand. Thomas nodded. "That's me. Message from Sheriff Conley in Laramie." The young man extended a folded paper, said it's urgent. Thomas took the note and unfolded it, his expression darkening as he read the brief message. "Eastern man asking questions about Boston woman. Claims to be family. Arriving your way tomorrow with lawyer. Conley sheriff need a reply," the messenger asked. Thomas refolded the paper. "Tell him I received his message, and that I'm obliged for the warning." As the messenger departed, Thomas turned his horse toward the ranch, his mind racing. Harrington had found them. The timing suggested he'd intercepted correspondence between Abigail and her attorney. Now he was coming, no doubt with legal papers and whatever authority money could buy. Thomas found Abigail hanging laundry behind the house, her hair tied back with a blue ribbon, sleeves rolled up against the summer heat. Seeing her thus at home on his ranch, engaged in the simple domestic task, stirred something protective in him that went beyond his promise to Edward. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, dismounting and leading her away from the curious ears of Martha, who was working nearby. In the privacy of the house, he handed her the sheriff's note. "Your Boston problem has found you." Abigail's face paled as she read. "How? I was so careful with my correspondence." "Money opens doors and loosens tongues," Thomas replied grimly. "Question is, what do you want to do about it?" "I won't run again," she said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly. I can't spend my life looking over my shoulder. Then we face him, Thomas decided, but on our terms, not his. What do you propose? Thomas considered the options. Harrington's coming with legal leverage, expecting to find a vulnerable woman alone. We need to change the equation. How? Marry me. The words hung between them in the quiet kitchen. Abigail stared at him, shock evident in her widened eyes. That's not a solution, Thomas, she finally said. It's an impulse born of chivalry. It's practical, he countered. As my wife, you'd have legal protection he couldn't easily override. My standing in the territory counts for something. Marriage is more than a legal arrangement. Not asking for more, Thomas said gruffly, though something in his chest constricted at her words. Just offering protection. When Harrington's dealt with, we could end it quietly if you wanted. Abigail studied his face. You would do that for me. Enter a marriage of convenience. Owe it to Edward, he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he recognized the dishonesty in them. This wasn't about a debt to a dead man. It was about the woman standing before him, a woman who had somehow slipped past his defenses and awakened feelings he'd thought long buried. I see. Her expression cooled slightly. While I appreciate the offer, I won't bind you to me out of obligation. There must be another way. Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Harrington arrives tomorrow. We don't have time for alternatives. Then I'll face him directly, Abigail decided. Perhaps confronting him on neutral ground with witnesses present will force him to behave honorably. Men like that don't know honor, Thomas growled. At least consider my proposal, not as a permanent solution, just a temporary measure until he's gone. Abigail's expression softened. I'll consider it, but only if you'll be honest about your reasons. This isn't about your debt to my uncle. Thomas couldn't meet her gaze. How could he explain what he himself barely understood? The way her presence had changed the ranch from a place of exile to something approaching a home. How the sound of her voice eased the constant ache in his chest. How he'd begun to plan his days around the moments he might see her. Need to alert the hands, he said instead, turning toward the door. Make sure they're prepared if Harrington brings trouble. He spent the remainder of the day ensuring the ranch was secure, positioning men at strategic points and sending word to neighbors he trusted. By nightfall, Triple Creek was as ready as he could make it for whatever tomorrow might bring. Abigail prepared supper as usual, though the meal passed in tense silence. After clearing the dishes, she joined Thomas on the porch, where he sat cleaning his revolver by lamplight. You expect violence? She asked quietly. Hope not. Prepare anyway. He checked the cylinder before holstering the weapon. Harrington struck me as the type to hire others to do his dirty work. You're probably right. She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. I've been thinking about your proposal. Thomas kept his eyes on the darkened landscape. And if I agreed, what would you expect of me? The question caught him off guard. Expect? Nothing different than now. You'd keep house, I'd run the ranch, just a paper arrangement to keep Harrington at bay. And after, if he accepts defeat and returns east, Thomas hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't thought beyond protecting her from the immediate threat. The idea of her leaving afterward created a hollow feeling in his chest he wasn't prepared to examine. Your choice, he finally said. Could stay as my housekeeper if you wanted, or move on to California. Divorce isn't simple out here, but it can be arranged. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. I'll agree on one condition. Name it. That you'll be honest with me about why you're making this offer, not about duty to my uncle, but the real reason. Thomas gripped the arm of his chair. Does it matter? Results the same. It matters to me. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the night sounds of the prairie distant coyotes, the soft nickering of horses in the stable, the creak of the windmill. Thomas struggled to find words for emotions he'd denied for so long. "You changed things," he finally said, his voice rough. "The house, the ranch, me," he paused. "Don't want to go back to how it was before." It was inadequate, nothing close to the full truth, but it was more honesty than he'd offered anyone in years. Abigail reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. "Then I accept," she said softly. They were married the next morning by Judge Wilson, who Thomas had summoned from Laramie at first light. The ceremony was brief and utilitarian, witnessed by Silas and Martha. Abigail wore her best dress, a green calico that matched her eyes with prairie wildflowers in her hair. Thomas had bathed and shaved, wearing the one good shirt he owned. The judge had barely departed when a cloud of dust on the horizon announced approaching riders. Thomas positioned himself on the porch, Abigail beside him. His hand rested near his holstered revolver as 4 men rode into the yard, 3 hired guns flanking a well-dressed man on an expensive bay horse. Nathaniel Harrington was younger than Thomas had expected, perhaps 35, with the polished appearance of Eastern money. His tailored suit seemed absurdly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the ranch. His expression shifted from confidence to surprise when he spotted Abigail standing beside Thomas. "Miss Morrison," Harrington called, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "What a relief to find you well after your impulsive departure from Boston. It's Mrs. Fletcher now," Thomas corrected before Abigail could respond. "You're addressing my wife." Harrington's smile faltered. "I see. A rather hasty arrangement, I presume. I wonder if the authorities would find such a convenient marriage suspicious, especially given the unusual circumstances." "Judge Wilson didn't find it suspicious," Thomas replied evenly. "Nor did Sheriff Conley, who's taking a particular interest in your visit to our territory, Mr. Harrington." One of Harrington's men shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his weapon. Thomas noted the movement without changing his relaxed posture, though every muscle was tensed for action. "I've brought legal papers regarding Miss Morrison's father's estate," Harrington said, regaining his composure. "There are discrepancies that require her attention in Boston." "Any legitimate business can be conducted through my wife's attorney," Thomas replied. "You've had a long journey for nothing, Mr. Harrington." Abigail stepped forward. "You never cared for my father, Nathaniel. You certainly don't care for me. Whatever claim you think you have to my family's business died with my parents." "You're being naive, Abigail," Harrington's voice hardened. "A woman alone in the wilderness, attaching herself to the first man who offers protection. Do you really believe this, Cowboy? Married you for anything but your inheritance." Thomas felt Abigail stiffen beside him. Before he could respond, 6 of his ranch hands emerged from various positions around the yard, rifles in hand. Silas stepped onto the porch, shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. "Mrs. Fletcher isn't alone," Thomas said quietly, "and she never will be again. I suggest you return to Boston, Mr. Harrington. Wyoming territory isn't hospitable to men who threaten women." Harrington's face darkened. "This isn't over, Fletcher. It is from where I'm standing." Thomas's hand moved to rest openly on his revolver. "Unless you'd care to continue this discussion more directly." For a tense moment, Harrington seemed to consider his options, glancing at his outnumbered men. Finally, he replaced his hat. "I'll be at the Laramie Hotel for 3 days. Should Mrs. Fletcher reconsider her hasty decision, I'll be willing to overlook this unfortunate situation." Without waiting for a response, he wheeled his horse and rode out, his men following. Thomas watched until they disappeared from sight, then turned to Abigail. "You all right?" She nodded, though her face was pale. "He won't give up easily. Maybe not, but he'll find it harder going than he expected. Thomas gestured to Silas, who approached with the shotgun still in hand. Keep men watching the approaches to the ranch. Double the night guard on the house and stables. Already arranged, Silas confirmed. Boys are ready if those fancy Easterners try anything. After Silas departed, Thomas and Abigail were left alone on the porch. The events of the morning, their hasty wedding, Harrington's arrival, the confrontation seemed to hang between them. "What happens now?" Abigail asked quietly. "We wait," Thomas replied. "See if Harrington makes another move or heads back east." "I meant with us, this marriage." Thomas met her gaze. "Nothing has to change, not until you want it to. And if I wanted things to change—" There was something in her voice, a vulnerability mixed with determination that made his heart beat faster. "Then we'd figure it out," he said simply. "Together." That night, Thomas slept on a bedroll in the main room, insisting Abigail keep the master bedroom. Despite the uncomfortable arrangement, he slept more soundly than he had in years, knowing she was safe under his protection. The threat from Harrington remained, but for the first time since the war, Thomas felt purpose beyond mere survival. Someone depended on him. Someone mattered. 3 days passed without incident. Thomas maintained vigilance, but Harrington made no further appearances at the ranch. On the 4th day, word came from Sheriff Conley that the Easterner and his men had departed on the morning stage headed for Cheyenne. "You think he's given up?" Abigail asked when Thomas shared the news. "Men like that don't give up," Thomas replied, pouring coffee at the kitchen table. "But they recalculate when the odds aren't in their favor. So we remain married." It wasn't quite a question. Thomas looked up from his coffee. "Unless you want otherwise." Abigail sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "This isn't how I imagined marriage would be." "Not much of a husband," Thomas acknowledged. "Haven't even taken you to town proper as my wife." "Perhaps we should," she suggested. "It might reinforce the legitimacy of our arrangement if people saw us together." Thomas considered this. Saturday's market day. Could drive in, let folks see us together. Might help if Harrington sends anyone asking questions. The trip to Laramie that weekend marked a turning point. As they drove the wagon into town, Thomas was acutely aware of Abigail beside him, wearing a blue dress he hadn't seen before, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat. People greeted them with newfound interest, word of their marriage having spread through the small community. Thomas found himself introduced as "my husband" repeatedly as Abigail navigated the general store, the milliner's shop, and the small market where local farmers sold produce. The phrase stirred something unexpected in him, a sense of pride he hadn't anticipated. When Mrs. Barton from the general store commented on what a fine couple they made, he didn't correct her assumption that theirs was a love match. Over the following weeks, the pretense of their arrangement began to blur. Thomas moved his few belongings back into the master bedroom, though he continued to sleep on a pallet on the floor, giving Abigail the bed. They settled into domestic routines, sharing meals, discussing ranch business, reading together in the evenings. Thomas found himself looking forward to these quiet moments, his customary isolation forgotten. Summer advanced into August, bringing scorching days and the distant rumble of thunderstorms in the afternoons. The threat from Harrington seemed to recede, though Thomas maintained vigilance. Abigail received word from her Boston attorney that Harrington had made inquiries about contesting the marriage, but had been advised of the legal difficulties in doing so from a distance. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching heat lightning play across the distant horizon, Abigail broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "Thomas, what are we doing?" He glanced at her. "Watching the storm come in." "You know what I mean." She turned to face him fully. We're living as husband and wife in every way except the most fundamental one. We share meals, manage the ranch together, present ourselves to the world as a married couple. Yet we maintain this fiction between us that it's merely an arrangement of convenience. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. That was our agreement. Yes, but is that all you want it to be? Her green eyes held his steadily. Because I find myself wanting more, and I need to know if I'm alone in that. The directness of her question left Thomas momentarily speechless. How could he explain that he wanted more but believed he had nothing worthy to offer? That the ghosts of his past made him unfit for the future she deserved? You could have a real husband, he finally said. Not a broken-down ex-soldier playing at ranching. Someone without the blood on his hands that I carry. I don't want someone else, Abigail said simply. I want you, Thomas Fletcher, the man who honors his debts, who protects those under his care, who reads Whitman by lamplight and thinks no one notices the tears in his eyes. Thomas looked away, unable to bear the understanding in her gaze. The things I've done, Abby, the men I've killed, not just in battle but after, hunting bounties. I'm not the man Edward would have wanted for you. My uncle knew exactly who you were, she countered, reaching for his hand. So do I. We see the man beneath the scars, Thomas. The question is, when will you? Before he could respond, the distant rumble of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Thomas was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his revolver as he scanned the darkening landscape. Get inside, he instructed Abigail. Could be nothing but Thomas Fletcher, a voice called from the approaching riders. We got trouble coming. Indians hit the Wallace place. The riders, 3 men from a neighboring ranch, reined in their horses in the yard. Their leader, Jack Wallace, was bleeding from a gash on his arm. Sioux war party, Wallace explained breathlessly. 15, maybe 20 braves, burned our house, ran off the stock. My wife and kids are safe at the Dennison place, but they're heading this way. Thomas's mind shifted instantly to tactical considerations. How long? Hour, maybe less. We tried to lead them off, but they're following the creek valley, headed straight for you. Thomas turned to Abigail. Get Martha and head for the root cellar. Take food and water, might be there a while. She grasped his arm. What about you? Need to defend the ranch. He looked into her eyes, suddenly aware that this might be their last conversation. Abby, don't you dare say goodbye, she interrupted fiercely. We'll finish our conversation when this is over, Thomas Fletcher. Something in her determination steadied him. He nodded once, then turned to Wallace. Get your men to the barn. Sela's will have rifles and ammunition. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas positioned his men around the ranch buildings, sent the youngest hands to drive the closest cattle into a protected draw, and prepared the house for potential siege. Through it all, the unfinished conversation with Abigail echoed in his mind. When the attack came, it was swift and chaotic. The Sioux warriors emerged from the darkness with war cries that chilled the blood, firing rifles and loosing arrows at the defenders. Thomas directed his men from the front porch, using the solid oak door as cover while returning fire. The battle raged for what seemed like hours, but was probably less than 30 minutes. 3 warriors fell to Thomas's rifle alone, while his men accounted for several more. The Sioux, finding the ranch better defended than expected, eventually withdrew, taking only a few horses from the outer corral. As silence settled over the ranch, Thomas conducted a grim accounting. 2 of his hands were wounded, one seriously with an arrow in his thigh. Jack Wallace had taken another bullet in his shoulder. The main house was intact, though the bunkhouse had caught fire from a flaming arrow and was now smoldering ruins. Most miraculous of all, no one had been killed. Thomas found Abigail in the root cellar with Martha and the ranch cook, an old Mexican named Miguel. She flew into his arms when he opened the trapdoor, her relief palpable. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "For now," he confirmed, suddenly aware of the blood on his shirt, not his own, but from tending the wounded. "Got men hurt. Need your help." Abigail immediately shifted to practical matters, following him to the house where the injured had been brought. She worked alongside Thomas through the night, cleaning wounds, applying poultices from Martha's herbal stores, and offering comfort to the suffering men. Dawn found them exhausted but victorious. The wounded were stable, the remaining stock secured, and riders dispatched to Laramie for the doctor and to alert the cavalry about the war party. Thomas stood on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson. He felt Abigail's presence before he heard her, a sixth sense that had developed over their months together. "You should rest," she said, coming to stand beside him. "You haven't slept, neither have you." He glanced at her profile, noting the smudges of dirt and blood on her face, the weariness in her posture. Even so, she was beautiful to him, strong, capable, undaunted by the chaos they'd endured. "I was afraid," she admitted quietly. "Not of dying, but of losing you before I could tell you." Thomas turned to face her fully. "Tell me what?" "That I love you, not out of gratitude or convenience, but truly." Her green eyes met his without hesitation. "I love the man you are, Thomas Fletcher, the man who carries more weight than anyone should bear alone." Something broke loose in Thomas's chest, a dam holding back emotions he'd suppressed since Antietam. Before he could second-guess himself, he pulled Abigail into his arms and kissed her with all the longing he'd denied for months. She responded with equal fervor, her hands gripping his shirt as if afraid he might disappear. When they finally parted, both breathless, Thomas pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you, Abby," he whispered hoarsely. "Have for longer than I was willing to admit. But you deserve better than a man with my past." "I deserve a man with your heart," she countered. "The past shaped you, but it doesn't define you. Not anymore." That night, for the first time, Thomas shared the bed with his wife, holding her close as they both surrendered to exhausted sleep. It was the first night in years he wasn't haunted by nightmares of the war. The attack on Triple Creek Ranch became a turning point in more ways than one. In its aftermath, neighboring ranchers formed a mutual defense association with Thomas as its leader. The cavalry increased patrols in the region, and a tentative peace was negotiated with the Sioux chief, whose young warriors had launched the unauthorized raid. More importantly for Thomas and Abigail, the pretense of their marriage of convenience was abandoned. They embraced their union fully, no longer maintaining the fiction that it was merely an arrangement to thwart Harrington. The ranch hands tactfully pretended not to notice the change, though Silas's knowing smile suggested nothing had escaped his attention. In September, a letter arrived from Abigail's attorney in Boston, with news that Nathaniel Harrington had been arrested for financial improprieties discovered during an audit of his business affairs. The charges were serious enough that he would likely spend years entangled in legal proceedings, if not prison. "Seems your Boston problem has solved itself," Thomas observed as they discussed the letter over supper. "Perhaps," Abigail agreed. "Or perhaps someone from Wyoming made inquiries that led to the audit." Thomas's expression remained neutral, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "Interesting coincidence." "Indeed." She studied him across the table. "Thomas Fletcher, did you set investigators on Nathaniel Harrington?" "Might have written to an Army friend who now works for the Treasury Department," he admitted. "Seemed like a man with Harrington's character would have secrets worth finding." Abigail's laughter filled the kitchen, a sound that had become Thomas's favorite melody. "My protective husband." I should be appalled by such underhanded tactics. But you're not, he observed with a smile. No, she agreed. I'm grateful, and perhaps a little impressed by your strategic thinking. As fall painted the Wyoming landscape in golds and reds, Triple Creek Ranch thrived under their joint stewardship. Thomas expanded the cattle operation, while Abigail established a small horse breeding program, starting with Lightning, the mare she had gentled. Her skill with horses proved to be more than a hobby, as buyers from as far as Denver came to purchase their stock. One crisp October evening, they sat on the newly expanded porch, wrapped in a shared blanket against the autumn chill. The main house had grown over the summer, with Thomas adding 2 new rooms in anticipation of future needs. I received a letter from Martha's niece in Cheyenne, Abigail mentioned, leaning against Thomas's shoulder. She's trained as a schoolteacher and seeking a position. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. 4 families with children within riding distance now, more coming next spring, according to Sela's. Might be time this area had a proper school. My thoughts exactly. We could offer the old line cabin as temporary quarters until something more suitable could be built. Already planning to improve the whole territory, Thomas teased, pressing a kiss to her temple. Just our corner of it, she replied with a smile. This is home now, Thomas. I want to help it grow. Home. The word still surprised him sometimes, how a place that had once been merely shelter had transformed into something sacred. How a marriage that had begun as protection had become the center of his world. Speaking of growth, Abigail continued, taking his hand and placing it gently against her stomach, we should consider adding another bedroom to those plans. Thomas went still, his eyes widening as he processed her words. Abby, are you saying? Her smile was radiant in the fading light. Doctor. Wilson confirmed it yesterday when he came to check on Miguel's cough. We'll have a new Fletcher at Triple Creek by late spring. Joy pure and overwhelming surged through Thomas. He gathered Abigail into his arms, burying his face against her neck as emotion threatened to overcome him. A child. A future. Things he had never dared hope for after the war had stripped him of everything. I never thought I'd have this, he confessed, his voice rough. A wife, a child, a home worth fighting for. Yet here we are, Abigail replied, framing his face with her hands. Living proof that even the most guarded heart can find room for love, if someone is determined enough to claim space within it. Thomas smiled at her choice of words, so perfectly describing their journey. You were always stubborn, Mrs. Fletcher. Fortunate for you, Mr. Fletcher, she returned, leaning forward to kiss him as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The following spring brought new life to Triple Creek Ranch. Thomas James Fletcher was born on a mild May morning with his father pacing nervously outside the bedroom door and Martha serving as midwife. The infant's lusty cries announced his arrival to a world vastly different from the one his father had known just 2 years earlier. Where once there had been isolation, now there was community. The schoolhouse Abigail had envisioned was under construction near the crossroads, with 5 families contributing labor and materials. The Mutual Defense Association had evolved into the beginnings of local governance, with regular meetings to address everything from water rights to mail delivery. And at the center of it all was Triple Creek Ranch, no longer a place of exile but the heart of a growing settlement. Thomas often marveled at the transformation as he watched Abigail with their son, or observed the expanding operations of the ranch, or simply sat on the porch in the evening, surrounded by the sounds of a home filled with life. On young Thomas's first birthday, a special delivery arrived from Boston, a package from Abigail's attorney containing papers releasing her from any remaining obligations related to her father's business, along with a small wooden chest that had belonged to Edward Morrison. That evening, after their son was asleep, Thomas and Abigail examined the chest's contents together: letters, photographs, and a journal Edward had kept during the war. "He would be proud of you," Abigail said softly as Thomas reverently handled the journal. "Of the life you've built, the man you've become." "I hope so," Thomas replied. "I've tried to live up to his belief in me." He paused, then added, "Found something else in town today." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch and handed it to Abigail. She opened it to find a simple gold band set with a small diamond, far more elegant than the plain ring they had hastily purchased for their wedding. "Thomas, it's beautiful, but we married for the wrong reasons," he interrupted gently. "Or at least, for incomplete ones. Thought maybe we could renew our vows, properly this time, because we choose each other, not because we had to." Tears glistened in Abigail's eyes as she slipped the ring onto her finger alongside her wedding band. "I'd like that very much." They renewed their vows on a perfect June day, with their son in Martha's arms and the entire community gathered to witness. Judge Wilson once again officiated, though this time there was no haste, no threat looming over the proceedings, only love freely given and joyfully received. As the years passed, Triple Creek Ranch continued to prosper. 2 more children joined the family: daughter Emma in 1870 and son Robert in 1872. The settlement around the ranch grew into a proper town, eventually named Fletcher's Crossing in honor of the man whose determination had helped establish it. Thomas never entirely escaped the shadows of his past. There were still nights when the ghosts of Antietam and Cold Harbor visited his dreams. But Abigail was always there when he woke, her presence a balm to his troubled soul. And with each passing year, the good memories outnumbered the painful ones. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas took Abigail to the same ridge where he had contemplated ending his life the day before she arrived. The landscape had changed: fenced pastures, cultivated fields, and the distant rooftops of Fletcher's Crossing now dotted what had once been empty prairie. "Hard to believe how different everything is," he remarked as they sat side by side on horseback, watching their 3 children playing in a meadow below, supervised by Martha's grandniece who served as their tutor. "Not everything has changed," Abigail replied, reaching for his hand. "You're still the most stubborn man I've ever known." Thomas laughed, something he did easily now, to the continued amazement of old-timers like Silas, who remembered the grim, silent man he had once been. "And you're still the woman who refused to accept that there wasn't room for her in my life," he countered with a smile. "In your heart," she corrected gently. "There's an important distinction." Thomas nodded, understanding completely. "Smart woman, suppose that's why I fell in love with you." "Is it?" Her eyes twinkled with mischief. "I thought it was my cooking." "That too," he agreed solemnly before breaking into another smile, "among other qualities." As they turned their horses back toward home, their home, built on courage and perseverance and love that had overcome the darkest of obstacles, Thomas felt a profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought Abigail Morrison to his door all those years ago. His heart, once scarred and sealed against human connection, now beat strong and sure, filled with a love that sustained him through each day and promised many more to come. There was room enough inside it for everything life had to offer: joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, and most of all, the family that had given him a second chance at truly living. For Thomas Fletcher, once a man determined to journey alone through life, the greatest discovery had been that the human heart was never truly full. It simply expanded to accommodate the love it was offered, if only one was brave enough to accept it.